So I have another term which is in this book. I've used many terms. One of them is digestion. One civilization getting digested into another. And I give the example of, a tiger digests a deer. So when the tiger digests a deer, there is no more deer left. There is no more deer left. Because whatever was found useful in the deer is broken down by the enzymes and by the stomach and the digestive tract into smaller and smaller parts until they are so small that there's no more DNA left of the deer. And then the tiger reassembles all of this into tiger DNA and turns into flesh and skin and blood and bones of the tiger. So at the end of the whole process, the tiger is well fed and becomes stronger, and the deer disappears, and whatever could not be made to fit into the tiger's paradigm, the tiger's framework of DNA, is rejected as skin and bones or excreted as waste. So the tiger ends up stronger, and the deer the good things are digested, or what is considered useful is digested, and what is considered not useful by the tiger is just thrown out. So civilizations have suffered that. The pre-Christian civilization of Europe, which were called pagans, kind of a derogatory term, they were digested into Christianity. That's how the Christmas tree comes, that's how the mother and son iconography comes, that's how Easter comes. Lots of rituals and symbols and ideas come from the pagans. But the pagans disappear. As though the pagans themselves disappear, but certain items are appropriated. Similarly, Native Americans, a whole lot of civilization is appropriated from the Native Americans, not just their land and their gold and their silver, but they had made some agricultural discoveries. I mean, potatoes, tomatoes, these kind of things came from the Americas, and they were brought into Europe and Asia. And a whole lot of other things came from the Native Americans. But the Native Americans themselves were genocided and put in museums. So they live in museums. They're not a living, thriving culture. And also, you go around and look in Africa, a lot of things came out of Africa, but the Africans themselves were marginalized. And today, Tibetan civilization is being digested into China. In another generation, Tibetan civilization will be living in museums, and the Chinese will be having tourism to go and show different monasteries and different things about Tibet, and Tibetans will be hired to enact and do a play for entertainment purposes. So they'll become like a Nautanki or circus or something, and they'll be tourist attraction, but not a living civilization anymore. So civilizations have been digested in the past and continue to be digested in the past. So one of my overriding concerns is Indian civilization being digested today? Yoga is being digested into Christian yoga, Jewish yoga, and quite rapidly. And the original Indians who brought yoga to this country, there were 5 or 6 major people. There was Muktanand, and there was Swami Satchidanand, and there were first few who came, who brought yoga, taught tens of thousands of Westerners to become yoga teachers. Now those guys are gone. Iyengar is the only one among the originals who is still alive, and he's also in his 90s. And so when the original founders go, that space is taken over by Western replacements who become the new gurus, who become the new big shots, and then they begin to take that idea, take that practice towards Christianity or towards Judaism or something of that sort. So what you're finding is that the decoupling with Indian spiritual traditions, the decoupling with the idea of some of the principles of Dharma is happening, and it is being recoupled with Judeo-Christianity. So that's an example of digestion which is happening right before our eyes. Another example is in neurosciences and cognitive sciences. A large amount of research that is currently going on uses yogis with higher states of consciousness, uses Buddhist meditators with high states of consciousness as though they're measuring rats, So they're measuring them as subjects, but the discoverer is not the yogi. The discoverer is the Westerner with the machine who measures it and writes a paper and puts his own name on it and comes up with a new name for what this phenomenon is going to be called. So for instance, I used to know a Buddhist called Francisco Varela, who died some years ago, And before he died in a conference, he was talking about neurophenomenology. And it was entirely Madhyamika Buddhism that he was talking about. And I asked him, why don't you, you've been initiated by His Holiness Dalai Lama, and you know, you spent 20 years actually as an ordained monk, but now you're kind of moved out of that and you're taking all that knowledge and developing your own patents and your own claims of original discovery and writing papers and changing the terminology. It's all about changing terminology, you know. So first he tried to say that you know, I'm doing you a favor because I'll make the Indian culture more popular and more credible. So I said, basically what you're saying is, what is mine must become yours to become credible. You know, it's like I'm nobody, so you come to my house, take all my art, take all my things and call it yours and display it, just so I should be very proud because you made it more credible. So that doesn't make any sense. And then I argued that, and then he said that the modern adaptation is the one that should be given credit, and we don't really need those old sources. So my response was that you don't use the same argument when you borrow from Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. You teach those with great pride. In all the American universities, you teach the Greek classics with great pride. You do not replace it with modern American thinkers and forget the Greek people. And that's because it's part of the West. Greek thought is part of the West. So you take great pride in showing that these ideas are actually from ancient origins, because those ancient origins are part of your origins, and part of your founding fathers, part of your sense of history. Why don't you do the same when you take an idea from Shankara or Abhinav Gupta or Patanjali or Panini or you know, many such people I can name you. When you mine them for ideas, you want to reformulate them and forget them. You are trying to erase those sources and claim new pioneers and new discoverers. So the standards of citing the past are different. In the case of Greece, you want to cite the past and show continuity of thought, and it's a matter of being very learned and educated to know Greek thought and Greek classics. But when something great comes out of Indian classics, the opposite. It's not pride to go and say, well, I got it from so and so. You want to claim that you got it for yourself. So he didn't have an answer to that. And I found the exact same thing in the appropriation of transcendental meditation by Herb Benson in Harvard, who called it relaxation response, got lots of trademarks, made a lot of money, and people in the West think that he's the originator of this. And Vipassana meditation got repackaged as mindfulness meditation out of Massachusetts. John Kabat-Zinn teaches that. And some Indian doctors some years ago came very excited from a workshop, and they said, we've learned new techniques, mind-body medicine techniques to heal certain conditions. Some Indian doctors in New Jersey you might know. And this guy was explaining how the technique works, and I said, that's Vipassana. That's what you describe as Vipassana. He said, no, this is mindfulness meditation. So I said, it's the same thing as Vipassana, and that is where this mindfulness meditation came from. So the guy couldn't believe it. The Indian also couldn't believe it. He didn't want to believe it because I was deflating his sense of accomplishment by calling it Indian. Whereas if he learnt it from some new, if it's considered a new Western technique, then it's something very sophisticated that he can be claimed he learned. So even the Indians have this complex that they'd rather have rediscovered their own heritage through a Western formulation than their original one. Then there is Stephen LaBerge in Stanford. There's a technique called Yoga Nidra. Yoga Nidra is a technique where the body is really sleeping, it's snoring in some cases, but you are conscious, you're awake, you're not sleeping. You're awake, at one level you're awake, but you're so still, there is no thought. You're awake and just as a witness. And sometimes I've felt, the wake consciousness is actually witnessing the body snoring. So that's very interesting. And this Yoga Nidra has many effects, many healing effects and many other effects. So Stephen LaBerge has renamed it lucid dreaming. So if you search lucid dreaming, you'll find that some Westerners are supposed to be pioneers, and the fact that this is basically lucid dreaming is not mentioned. So when he gives talks, sometimes I go to him and say, why don't you, I tell him that this is Yoga Nidra. Privately, he admits it. Privately, he says, yes, I was in Rishikesh, I had this such and such guru, and I learned this for 20 years, and I'm very grateful to India, and I learned all that, blah, blah. So I tell him, why don't you tell this in the audience, why don't you tell everybody, why don't you write in the papers? And he says that it won't be considered science anymore. It will be considered some Eastern quackery or some mystical stuff, and it's not real science. So I have to remove all that, then it's science, it's taken seriously. So there's all these excuses for appropriation and plagiarism. That's really what this amounts to. I'm not against sharing of knowledge. Knowledge is universal and everybody should benefit from it. But if you connect it to the source, then the source gets nurtured and more people are encouraged to learn from that source. Whereas if you think that you understood the source, you throw it out, remove all the original, and you've got some reformulated thing on it, and that's what goes forward, then actually the source is no longer considered relevant. And that's the problem I have with some of the New Age spinning, respinning of our tradition, because it makes the original tradition look irrelevant. And it can be put in a museum, except for a few scholars, we don't need it, because for the general public we have a better new thing with new pioneers and new discoverers. Now as far as lucid dreaming is concerned, the US Army did some research on how to de-traumatize soldiers in Iraq. This is done 10 years ago or so, because they get very traumatized. When they go and do duty for a few hours, they get highly traumatized. So they shortlisted, after looking at many techniques, they shortlisted 3 or 4. And this lucid dreaming, which is actually Yoga Nidra, was one of them. And then they did some clinical trials, and they selected lucid dreaming as the most effective technique for de-traumatizing soldiers. So some guy called Miller, he got his multi-million-dollar contract from the US Army to go and teach this modern American technique called lucid dreaming to the Army, so that the soldiers, after they're traumatized, they can get de-traumatized, go back and fight more. So you see, once a technique has been disconnected from its source, it can be put to all kinds of use. It can be distorted also. And its authenticity can be gone. It can become something quite different than what it was intended to be. So this is all part of what I call digestion. And I'm writing a sequel to this book on how a whole lot of Indian civilization is being digested by these kinds of phenomena. Lots of examples I have. And the purpose of the Being Different book is to establish what is so different about the Indian civilization that many Westerners come, they appreciate what they're learning, they benefit from it, but there's some boundary they can't cross because then it affects their own identity. What is that boundary? What will happen if they crossed it? What will it do to their own sense of history and the sense of their own tradition? Why is it that they cannot be at that boundary and be in both? There seems to be a tension, mutual tension, and a decision has to be made whether the person wants to be on this side or the person wants to be on that side. So I'm close with an example, a very prominent guy called T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot is considered probably the most important poet of the 20th century, American poet. And he wrote many great poems, very famous ones, The Wasteland, the Four Quartets. And if any of your kids goes to study English, they'll study T.S. Eliot's poetry. What is not known that he was a Sanskrit scholar and he was studying Upanishads. He had Upanishads, Gita, and many of the translations in the margin from the Sanskrit book he was writing in English margins, his translations. And those passages are some of the passages in his most famous poems. And there's Dr. Cleo Kearns in Princeton. I worked with her. She did her PhD dissertation on T.S. Eliot and Indic traditions. That's her PhD topic. And Cambridge University Press published that book about a decade ago. And our foundation got the rights to publish an Indian edition, so we have an Indian edition now. People want, I can get you that. And basically, what this lady did is she went and looked at the personal diaries of T.S. Eliot, which were not known to the public. She went and lived with T.S. Eliot's widow and got access to all his personal diaries, his personal collection. And she found that at Harvard he was studying Sanskrit for several years, and he had a whole Sanskrit collection, and as he was practicing translation into English, those passages ended up entering some of his most important poems. That's a very interesting thing. Now, at some point he writes in his diaries that the profoundness of the Sanskrit classics, what he calls Sanskrit classics, the great Sanskrit thinkers, great Sanskrit texts and philosophers, that profoundness is so great that all the American great Western thinkers look like schoolboys. That's his term. And by comparison, it makes the American thinkers, he named all these great thinkers, they seem like schoolboys. That's how he says. And then, a few years later, Eliot contemplates that this is a profound journey of life. He's very impressed. He wants to go into this further. And he contemplates moving to India. He writes that to continue this journey, what I should do is give up everything, go to India, and just sort of continue in this journey. That's what he's thinking of doing. And then he's writing in his diary that what will he have to give up, to do that? Is it practical? And he writes at one point, very candidly, he says that to go any further into this philosophy, I will have to let go. I will have to let go of my identity as an Englishman. I will no longer be able to hang on to my sense of identity as an Englishman, as an American. And so, am I willing to do that? That's what he asks. And then he concludes that he's not willing to give up his friends and family and be alienated and go all the way into this. And so he decides he will not go to India, and he will not pursue this going into deeper and deeper layers of Indian philosophy. Now, he's stuck in the middle, because this is the middle point where he's sufficiently kind of tainted with Sanskrit, if you will. Yeah? He's sufficiently contaminated with this Indian thought. He's no longer this pure, like he originally was a Westerner. He's had enough of this experience brought into his life. And yet he's not gone over the bridge, gone over the border and become totally Indianized either. He's sort of neither here nor there. So he decides to get re-baptized as a Christian. A very public ceremony. Now, baptizing is usually done for a child. You don't see too many people who are in their 40s getting baptized. But it is done sometimes. If you feel that somehow your solid faith in Christianity has been compromised, then as a kind of sort of like doing another yagna kind of thing, you do like some people get married again, to the same person, they get married a second time just to kind of revive that. So he has at Harvard, he has a very public, and it's not just rebaptized at a later age, but in public. So with all people watching, he's getting rebaptized in public ceremony. And then he writes that now that I'm very clear who I am, this mishmash, wishy-washy mixture is not there. I'm very clear. I'm now Christian, brought back to Christianity. Now I can continue studying Sanskrit as something about them. Now it's not confusing as to is it mine, is it them? Am I studying about myself when I'm studying it, or am I just out of curiosity studying about some other people? So it's a very interesting, what I call a U-turn. He returns back to himself, and there is a certain rejection, not a rejection in the sense of denigrating or debunking the Sanskrit tradition, but limiting how far it will influence him, how far he's willing to go and not go any further. So that's the sort of discovery one makes if one keeps looking for what are the differences. And when people come from one side or when people come from the other side of this boundary, how far are they willing to go and why aren't they willing to cross over and go to the other side beyond a certain point. So this methodology that I've just described to you is what led me to many kinds of differences which I had to test with outsiders from other traditions and insiders from our own traditions, and then go back to the drawing board and come up with something better. And I kept repeating this book, rewriting this book maybe 10 times. Read this book about 10 times. And given it, every time I've given it to scholars of both traditions. And rewritten after their feedback comes in. So the book that you now have is a product of this sort of journey.
Really enjoyed your talk. You used the word digestion in your talk significantly to talk about, and the examples that you gave about the deer and the tiger, or even about the yoga being taken here and kind of changed into a different form. Isn't digestion really evolution, Darwinian evolution? And what is, as an Indian, what is wrong in the fact that I should be proud that yoga is being practiced here in the West. How does it matter that they don't attribute it to, let's say, a yoga nidra? That is my conflict, really.
Sure, I understand that. It's a very common issue that comes up, and I'm very glad you raised it because I'd like to address it. Firstly, I'm not at all opposed to cross-cultural fertilization. It's not that I don't want people to take ideas of another culture and benefit from them. After all, that's the whole purpose. We have to share, all the cultures and civilizations have to share good ideas with each other for the collective evolution of humanity. So that is not an issue, that is a good thing to be doing. The difference between borrowing and digestion is, if I borrow your ideas, I don't have to destroy you. When a tiger digests from a deer, the deer ceases to exist. The deer is finished. So it is, what characterizes digestion is not that ideas have crossed over, but the source is depleted and finished off. Now, how this happens is very interesting. A whole lot of the examples I gave you of civilizations that got digested, once what was considered useful has been taken, there was no reason to keep them alive. That is what happened to them. All the examples I gave you, they're sitting in museums. But why is it that the Greek, we borrowed from the Greek, but because they're considered part of the Western past, therefore Greek thought is taught in the academy. It's taught in the academy with great pomp and great glory, and everybody, to be a real true intellectual or Westerner, must have studied Greek classics. So when you keep Greek classics alive, even though that classical thought is not living in any civilization, if you go to Greece, they are not practicing, there is nobody who's a Platonic person there. That is a just dead civilization. But it is kept artificially alive by being taught in the academy on a regular basis. You do not find in the teaching of world thought or in the teaching of classics, you do not find a whole lot of places that teach Indian classics. And the reason they don't teach Indian classics is they feel that what was useful is mind turned into Western stuff, so we can teach it as Western stuff and we can ignore the Indian thought. The thing about a thought is that unless there is a next generation of students, unless there is a sampradaya, unless there is a lineage that keeps that thought alive, the thought atrophies. Ignoring a thought, you putting it aside and not using it, atrophies and it won't evolve and develop further. How many places do you go to where they teach Bhartahari, or they teach Abhinav Gupta, or they teach Nagarjuna? They don't. And these are some of the most profound thinkers who have influenced world thought. But the people who learned are replaced. They are considered the exemplars worth studying. So today, there is a person called Ken Wilber, whose mind and digested Sri Aurobindo. It started a very powerful movement, which has become so powerful in the West that now people are saying, why bother reading Sri Aurobindo, is too complicated. Ken Wilber makes it easier, more palatable, more interesting, more user-friendly, and of course he's got a lot more money. And the interesting thing is that this Wilberism, which is a digested form of Sri Aurobindo, is being re-exported back to Pondicherry and Auroville, where the Sri Aurobindo movement is. And Indians there are really going gaga over Wilburism because they can get a grant, they can go to California, and if they write a paper on how Sri Aurobindo is superseded by Wilbur, then then it looks good for them. So it's become a matter of prestige and pride. So the disowning our own tradition because a Western equivalent is considered more exciting does harm to our own sources. This is also happening in Ayurveda in some cases, because some of the Ayurveda turning into pills and getting FDA approved, and changing the framework from the true Ayurveda, but because the true Ayurveda is such individualized medicine, so one-on-one, and that the idea of making a generic pill kind of destroys that knowledge. In a generation or two, people will not find it necessary to read that knowledge at all. So we already know that a huge amount of classical Indian knowledge is lost. So there is destruction. It is lost when nobody keeps reading it and studying it and teaching the next generation. So when if you were to say that, well, whatever there was in Vedas, whatever there was in Upanishads, we can read Deepak Chopra, we can finish off Upanishads. Why do you want to read Upanishads? We can read Deepak Chopra. So what would happen if that were true? If there weren't Swamiji teaching Upanishads, and enough people are doing that, enough of you students doing that, and if all of you were to enroll in Deepak Chopra's academy and say we can learn 7 days of this and 8 days to do that, then we can learn this simple pop culture kind of stuff, then what will happen is in another generation or two, or at some point in the future, the Upanishads will be something that needs to exist as a living culture. There will be hardly anybody who knows how to do it. Already, there are many Indian texts where there is nobody who knows how to interpret because they can't find students. I know of great Indian thoughts and practices and meditation techniques and sadhanas, and I know of knowledge which is only in the hands of some very old people, and their biggest complaint is we cannot attract young people because they rather go to this new kind of stuff which is easy and exciting and fashionable. So what has happened is not, the problem is not the others borrowing the knowledge. The problem is the atrophy and the death of the traditional dhara, the stream. So now somebody called, I've forgotten his name, Andrew Cohen, who's a big name in India teaching Vedanta, running around teaching Vedanta. Yeah? So all the Delhi middle class and upper strata, they love to go to this Andrew Cohen, and it's like his own idea, his own thing. So this, it is not that somebody else has borrowed, which is great, but the bypassing, ignoring, hiding, erasing the source harms that source. So that is my concern. So when we say we should be very proud, I differentiate. There's a guy who wrote this book, American Veda, and he's going around praising how the Americans have digested a lot of Indian stuff. And I'm having a big argument with him because I've actually explained to him this whole phenomenon and helped him with many of his sources, which is what he's using to write his book. But the final point I made, he excluded it from his book. The final point I made is that after they learned all this and they Americanized it, then they went the next step to erase the Indian sources, like somebody who comes in, an arsonist. Arsonist is somebody who first robs the establishment and then he burns it down so there's no evidence left. So this is a kind of an arson because the act of burning down or destroying is part of what the person is doing. I would love to see Indian thought taught in the West on par with Greek thought. I would love to see Sanskrit given the same status as Greek and Latin classical languages, and the 20, 30 great Indian thinkers of classical era being given the same status as Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and all their great thinkers. And I would love to have the standard that when an American student is using some of these Indian ideas, his requirement to cite source and references is taken as seriously in the peer review as when he's trying to cite a Western source, where he never get away with trying to claim originality if he's actually borrowing a Platonic idea or an Aristotle idea. He's his teacher will say you have to reference it and give credit. So I'm just looking for a level playing field, because this level playing field will ensure the continuity of our civilization, and not only for the benefit of for this country, but the effect, the mirror effect it has in India is very strong. In Indian philosophy departments, the only place I know where they teach Indian philosophy on par with Western philosophy is Jadavpur University. Jadavpur University, they have Indian philosophy, Western philosophy being taught. Most places you go, the Department of Philosophy is teaching Western philosophy. That's what they're mostly teaching. And there may be one or two guys who are teaching Indian philosophy. So why has this happened? It's happened because what was considered worthwhile of Indian thought got somehow mapped onto something else, and the Indian source got removed. So for me, I'm not part of these movements. You know, there are popular movements going on in the US where people are against, you know, Americans have stolen our yoga. I consider that to be very, not very wise. I agree with you. We should not be fighting on grounds of nostalgia. We should be fighting if there's a distortion. If there's a distortion. And there is a distortion in some of these cases. Because when you are fitting yoga into Christianity, you take the parts which will fit into the tiger's DNA, and you reject and throw out the parts which will not. And you kind of eliminate them, ignore them, or even outright reject them. So certain aspects of the higher states of consciousness won't fit. In the case of Jung, Carl Jung, he studied Patanjali Yoga Sutra, and in the 1930s he was teaching a summer institute in Zurich on yoga. He was teaching chakra system, he was teaching Kundalini system. He was teaching all this. He concludes that out of the 7 chakras, the first 5 he can realize, and it can fit biblical thought and Western thought. But the 6th and 7th chakra, where there is transcendence, he cannot achieve it himself, and he feels that it will totally destroy the Western system of thinking. So he writes very clearly that he does not want his students to practice the higher chakras. So essentially, he cuts off the chakra system after the 5th chakra. The 6th and 7th chakra, he doesn't want people to know about it. So there is a distortion. And given that he is so powerful compared to our people, a person like that, his knowledge spreads widely. So this is the digestion that I'm concerned about.
Sanskrit is recognized now as a mother of all Indo-European languages. And this kind of thoughts, this kinds of evolution in a different way of thinking is possible only if people like you and people like us who are going to the mission, who have better understanding of our own history, our own traditional values, speak up more. And I'm seeing that happening already, and I hope that your book is a milestone in that direction. Thank you for your book.
Thank you very much, but I want to reinforce the point you just made, very important point you just made. It's partly a response to the first question. Sanskrit, because there are people who are not willing to give it up and replace it with equivalent words somewhere else. People who feel that there is something in the grammar, something in the beach mantra, something in the primary sounds of Sanskrit which is unique and distinct and has to be preserved. It is because of the collective effort of these people that finally people are realizing, now there's something called computational linguistics, where they're realizing that Sanskrit grammar has some very unique properties for computational linguistic purposes. So, you see, suppose, to answer the first question, because you're helping me answer the first question, suppose Sanskrit had been replaced with something equivalent and it had been gone, then whatever future value it is going to bring in computational linguistics would not have happened. So, if it had been digested, the source would have disappeared. People would have said, okay, we learned Panini, and now we've learned how to do grammar in all the European languages, we don't need Panini anymore, but luckily it didn't happen. Luckily, people are now beginning to understand that the mantra, vibration, quality of the syllables of Sanskrit have some unique properties which cannot be replaced by translating into something else. Now that being the case, the argument is a very strong argument in response that you better preserve this, because this is like, like we say, there's biodiversity and there is eco-diversity, and if a certain species of DNA is finished, you will never get it back. And it has some value unique to itself, unique value. And so you, just like you want to preserve the DNA and the biodiversity in in the animal world and in the plant world. Similarly, in the world of languages, in the world of culture, in the world of spiritual traditions, you do want to preserve that diversity and not digest it and replace it with some simple equivalents. So I'm very glad you made this point. Yes?
Like the first question just said, I did enjoy the way it had been described. We generally believe the Eastern is more intuitional and the Western is the logical part side of it, more scientific advancements, so many things we have seen. When the Westerners grab the concept from wherever they are, particularly the ones which they take it from yoga and things like that, why do they feel that they have to change a little bit and call it, and not respecting the source where it came from, but they are supposedly to be more logical than just, so is it basically their way of setting things up around, or
no, I'll answer.
From your experience, what do you feel?
Yeah, I have a thesis called the U-turn theory, and this book is the first of 7 volumes. This book is, on being different, creates some basic categories and foundation, and I'm writing 6 more volumes called the U-turn theory, which is exactly on that question. It is on the journey of the Westerner who goes and studies these things, and why does he need to U-turn? I gave you the answer in the case of T.S. Eliot, because he would no longer be an Englishman if he went further. He had to keep that identity with his friends and family, the cohesiveness together. So he could go up to a point, and when further journey would disconnect him and contradict his sense of Judeo-Christianity, he didn't want to go any further. So that in his case, that was the reason. Now, in my studies on U-turn theory, I found many, many reasons why the Westerners would appropriate, recontextualize it, call it their own, rather than continue going further. It's not lack of logic and rationality on Indians' part. We have Nyaya, we have Tarka, we have mathematics, we have astronomy. We built great cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa built on high precision. We had weights and measures. We had metallurgy with nanotechnology. So I don't think that, I don't agree with the view which is commonly held that Indians were great mystics and otherworldly and escapists and didn't know much about practical matters which the West knew. Because until, say, the 1500s, the West was behind in industry, in technology of metallurgy, steel, in textiles. So traditionally, we've had great thinkers and very practical people in the material world also, and in the world of logic and rationality also. So the reason is different why Westerners want to think of this as their own. Several reasons. First, the Western Academy places a high emphasis on publish or perish. And to publish, it has to be called original work. You cannot say that I've basically taken Maharishi's technique and measured a few people and I'm going to crank out a lot of PhDs and call and get some patents from National Institute of Mental Health. You have to give it your own name. You have to disconnect it and disown that you learned anything from Maharishi. I'm just giving you that as one example. So to claim originality is very much part of the system and the ego here. Like, people who do art put their name on it, whereas in India traditionally they didn't put their name on it. So it is more about ownership, the idea of private property, the idea of advancement of science and technology with the use of, being able to take credit for originality. Part of it is like that. Part of it is that the buyers, the client base, the people who buy your books, so many authors have told me that I've done this U-turn in which I've removed my early influences from Hinduism and Buddhism because my book agent told me that if you get rid of all that stuff, you'll sell more books. You'll sell more books. It's not just the Science Academy that will give me better grants. It's also that I will sell more books because the average population want to see that these are Western American ideas, whereas if they came out of another culture, it punctures the ego, the sense of superiority that the average person here has. So whereas if it came from Greece, because Greece is part of our own past heritage in the West, it's not a threat. If it came from somewhere else, it's a threat. So the idea that something is made in France, because France is part of who we are as Westerners, is glorified. Perfumes fact that, but if you want to say that this came out of, the exact same thing came out of, you know, another civilization with a lower brand value, it lowers the value of that thing. So partly it's personal, it's ego, it's career, careers wanted, institutions want this kind of a behavior, and partly it's the public attitude and public appearance of what is superior, what is inferior, and how a person wants to be associated with one or the other. That's my finding of this. So I want to open up to some questions from especially the young kids. And do you feel comfortable talking about your faith? How do others feel when you talk about your faith? Are there issues you face that are, you know, you're not sure of, you want to